Lives and living conditions of house slaves. In the 1800s, there were 4.5 million slaves working on plantations.
That's a lot.
Yeah. The house slaves lived in terrible environments, such as the attics or corners and closets of the owner's house, of their big houses.
It was so uncomfortable.
And they didn't have any furniture. They had very little. So what these house slaves did was they got old rags or cloth or anything they could find, and they made beds out of them to sleep on. And most slaves were separated from their families and their friends because they were property to their masters, and so they were not together. And when a house slave complained or did something wrong, they had really bad punishments, like being whipped and even beaten to death.
That's terrible.
Yeah. But most house slaves actually lived better than the field slaves.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah.
And even sometimes their masters were kind enough to give them some limited amount of clothing. In summer occasions, their owners would actually give them hand-me-downs. So they just pass on whatever they didn't want. So that was good for them.
Yeah.
Eating and health conditions. House slaves usually had better food than field slaves, but in some cases their masters would prevent them from eating leftovers by spitting in the food.
So they'd rather waste the food than let their slaves eat.
Yeah. Because they probably felt that it was the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
mean.
Yeah. Many were fed the scraps of meat that were considered unedible to the owners, like the brain, eyes, feet, tails, ears, and tongues of pigs and cows. And they were limited to such a low food source that they didn't get the proper nutrients, which led to high risks of catching diseases. And it's sad to say, but they were unable to have any rights to health care because they were just considered property. They weren't considered human beings. They couldn't even try to sneak food because owners knew exactly how much food they had, and if there was any missing, the slaves would be punished.
So they measured the food to keep track.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And the slaves also became ill because their African bodies were not used to the food and germs in America, because there's like such a different, like it's just different
diseases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And different food styles in the two countries.
They're not used. Their bodies aren't used
Yeah.
to it. Yeah. So, working schedules of house slaves. House slaves worked from morning to night, 7 days a week. So, all the time.
Yeah.
They had to stay awake until all members of the family retired and went to bed. So, they had to wait to go to sleep before everybody else. And then they had to be awake before any members of the family woke up the next morning. So they had to wake up at the crack of dawn.
That'd be hard considering they didn't even have like anything to wake them up and like alarm them that family would be awake soon like we have now. You know?
Yeah. House slaves were required to work on Sundays, and some actually went to church with their masters, but yet they were not entitled to their own religious instructions, so they couldn't believe what they wanted to.
Yeah.
So the rest of their days involved cleaning and cooking for the families. So they served their meals and cleaned the house and everything. And house slaves pretty much raised their owners' children.
Yeah.
They're like the parents to them.
Relationships between slaves and their owners. In some cases, the slaves were promised freedom, like when their masters died, but unfortunately, the promises were not followed through with in most cases.
So they were promised that they'd be let go.
Yeah,
but it didn't happen.
Yeah. And most of them probably looked forward to it and were
Believed
disappointed.
it.
So.
Yeah.
And the slaves had no rights to education, but some families, the women would teach them like how to read and write. So if the children were young and the slaves were taught to read and write, they could help with the children learning to read and write.
Which that
too.
wasn't permitted. They weren't
Yeah.
allowed to be educated.
Yeah, but
Some lucky ones did get educated.
some of the owners were friendly with their slaves, which most other like owners found it like as nonsense, and it was illegal. So, and house slaves had to listen to their family members' emotions and feelings and problems because they were so close with the families and they kind of grew friendships with them.
Well, their slaves pretty much like grew up with their children
Yeah.
and like have been there throughout all their lives, so they
Yeah.
know each other pretty well.
Yeah.
So this is the slaves' living conditions. As you can see, it's really tight and space is limited and everything is just cluttered together. So it wasn't sanitary, it wasn't clean or healthy for them. And it was just really hard for so many slaves to be together in such tight quarters.
This is a picture of a slave being beaten. This shows that when they misbehave and complain, this shows what happens to them. And some slaves were even beaten if they had poor health. And it shows that when they have wounds like this, they can get infected, and some owners even put salt in their wounds to cause more pain for the slaves.
So in this picture, you can see a house slave. She is braiding the children's hair, the owner's daughter. And you can see that by the smile on her face, she really does care about the child because she's practically raised her since she was born, and she takes care of them and their health and makes sure that they're groomed properly. And they really grow relationships, strong relationships for each other.
This is a picture of a house slave from the 1800s, and this is the fireplace where she cooks the meals. And as you can see, she has many different like pots to cook the dinner in, and this looks like it could be like an oven maybe. And some slaves had to work with such little cooking supplies, but this slave looks lucky because she has like multiple sizes of pots, and she has two different ways to cook. She has the oven and the fireplace. So it looks like she has an easier way of doing her job.